All right. Well, here we are in our final lecture. I've really enjoyed this class. I mean, as you can tell, I love these texts. I love having the opportunity to share my thoughts with them, the reasons why I love them, share those thoughts with you. I mean, and even more, I've enjoyed reading your papers and your ideas, how you've engaged with these texts. It's just been a true pleasure. So thank you for being part of this class with me. In the final lecture, we're going to turn our attention now to contemporary world literatures. It's interesting, as I was reading and preparing to lecture on the background and context from this eighth and final section of the textbook, I just thought, well, these are things I've lived through in my life. It's funny to read literature that exists in the context of our own world we're currently living in. And so a lot of these events are, especially the much more recent ones, are probably very familiar to you. But nonetheless, let's dive in and take a look at what events and things shaped the history of the latter half of the 20th century. So the previous section of the book, number 7, covered the post-war, post-colonial period from 1945 to 1968. And the editors intentionally blocked off that period of time for a couple of reasons, starting with the end of World War II and going up to 1968. So why use 1968 as kind of a dividing point between this post-war literature and then more contemporary literature? Well, it was a big year. The 1960s saw all kinds of cultural revolution. I'm sure you're aware of some of that history. Student protests and student rebellions were a big part of that 1960s cultural revolution. The idea that young people kind of seizing the power, seizing the moment, taking advantage of the moment, and giving their voice a chance to speak about their concerns, what was important to them, was a new and in some ways, really cool thing. That those people found a voice. And so there were student rebellions in Prague, Paris, Mexico City, among other places. Those are the most prominent ones. And the rebellion in Prague being the biggest of those three biggest ones mentioned there, really focused on communism and students wanting to overthrow communism because so many of the governments in communist countries were dictatorships and totalitarian in nature. And so many of the points we're going to cover here have to do with the decline and downfall of communism, because if you saw the history of the 1945 to 1968 period real clearly, you saw that was really marked by the Cold War. And so here we're seeing the end of that. So a focus of many of the protests was the Vietnam War, which, as we mentioned last time, was what we called a proxy war. Since it was a Cold War, the hot wars that took place as part of the Cold War were fought by proxy or from a distance in other countries to avoid nuclear catastrophe. But Vietnam finally ended, after all the protests in 1975. And then things really cooled down a bit after that. There were other proxy wars or small wars fought between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the 70s and 80s, but they were pretty small compared to Korea and Vietnam. And it was mainly a period marked by what we use the French word détente, which means peace, or not peace, but a ceasing of fighting would be a better way to say that, because most of the presidents who served in the 70s and 80s really tried to negotiate peace talks. There were a lot of peace talks, and that was good. And eventually, one of the world leaders, the premier of Russia, Mikhail Gorbachev, he wanted to have some really democratic reforms and basically move away from what his communist predecessors had done. But his reforms went even further than he intended and eventually led to the end of communist Russia, the end of the Warsaw Pact, those alliances between Russia and Eastern Europe, and the end of the USSR. So the Soviet Union split up into multiple countries. And if you remember, I think I mentioned this in the last lecture, when you had the western part of the world represented by NATO and the eastern part of the world, communist part, represented by the Warsaw Pact, the Berlin Wall was constructed in Germany to represent to divide East and West Berlin, because the western side was aligned with capitalist NATO and the eastern side was aligned with communist Warsaw Pact. And so when the USSR dissolved, communism ended in that part of the world, in the Warsaw Pact, those nations broke apart, the Berlin Wall came down, which was an incredibly symbolic moment of this very significant and hopeful period, because people were now free from the totalitarian dictatorships of the communist nations. And no longer, the Cold War was over then. No longer separated. The wall represented this kind of physical separation between people. It was a physical separation, that represented the kind of global disconnect that was part of the Cold War. And so the Berlin Wall coming down was a huge event. And it took place in 1989. And the textbook points out that 1989 was also a huge year for just a number of important events. So what were some of those events besides the Berlin Wall? Well, the first steps were taken in South Africa toward ending apartheid. World literature is just so much to cover because we're looking at all these different countries. So we have not talked about South Africa too much, but we did talk about Rhodesia quite a bit, which is now called Zimbabwe, when we studied Doris Lessing a few lectures ago. And Zimbabwe and South Africa are both countries located in the very southern part of Africa, where the majority of the citizens are black. But for a long time, the leadership was entirely white. And it was pretty oppressive in both countries. And it was really oppressive in South Africa. And that form of white oppressive leadership and majority black South Africa was called apartheid. And so the first steps toward ending it began in 1989 with Nelson Mandela, I believe, being released from prison in the year 1990 and then becoming the first black president of South Africa in 1994. I don't think our textbook offers us a South African author. We do have Doris Lessing from Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe, and it was a similar situation of an oppressive white government ruling a black majority country in Africa, and the white minority oppressive government ended in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia in 1980. So some really hopeful things there. If you want to read a great South African author, there are several. The best is probably J.M. Coetzee. It's spelled Cotzee. He has a number of great novels. The one I've read and enjoyed is called Disgrace. There's also a South African novel called The Whale Caller, not Whale Rider. Don't mix them up, Whale Caller. I can't remember the author's name, but they're both very good. On a little less optimistic note, another major event from 1989 was the Tiananmen Square Massacre, which was another student protest against communist China, which didn't become capitalist till much later than the Soviet countries. But the student protest there, another example of student protest. And unfortunately, a number of the students were massacred when the government responded. So that was a little bit less encouraging event, obviously, but there did in the 1990s start to be capitalist inroads in China. And so the 90s was really a decade marked by hope. The falling of the Berlin Wall signaled a shift from what had been, just as the textbook and I have both pointed out, the bloodiest century in the history of the world, to its final decade being one of hope, because many of the dictatorships in Latin America that had actually been funded by the U.S. as part of the drug war, some of those started to end. There were peace talks in places throughout the world that had been in conflict. The 80s had been very violent in Ireland. The phrase "the Troubles" in Northern Ireland is used to describe the violence happening there in the 1980s, but in the 90s, the two Irish states, Northern Ireland, that wanted to remain part of the British Empire, and the People's Republic of Ireland, that wanted to be their own separate governing body. They started to have peace talks in the 90s. And Israel and Palestine, which had been locked into a religious war for decades, they were finally starting to have some peace talks. So the 90s were, in many ways, kind of generalizing here, but as the textbook says, the 90s were in many ways a decade of hope. But that hope ended with, I'm sure you could guess it based on the timing, September 11th, 2001. I'm sure most of you are old enough to remember this, although we're coming up on 20-year anniversary here, which sounds much longer ago than it feels to someone like me who remembered, seeing it on TV, which is an incredibly devastating event. It's one of those events that's world-shattering for people. It was just, for many people, I think it was so unexpected. And then in other parts of the world, it wasn't that unexpected or surprising to people. I think in the U.S., it was very surprising to us. And so it's not just September 11th that was traumatic and hope-crushing, but the aftermath of it, the wars that followed in the Middle East and are still going on, have kind of made people feel like, well, we're in the same cycle, a similar type of scenario to the 20th century where there's just a lot of fighting and dying. And so, what do we turn to for hope in these times? Well, we turn to these authors. I think these authors give us a glimpse into reality, as the premise of the course states, and they provide literary techniques and ideas that give us hope. A couple other events I'll just end with real quickly. We can't ignore the significance of the information revolution. This, I know you're very familiar with: smartphones, computers, the internet, social media. They've unified distant parts of the globe more rapidly than the printing press, the telegraph, the telephone. These earlier inventions that brought the world together, made it more interconnected, have now, they made it more interconnected, but these recent technological revolutions, internet, computers, smartphones, social media, etc., have brought people together even more so, in both negative and positive ways. But we're not going to go into all those now because you know what they are very well. But even faster than those earlier pieces of technology. And finally, I'll end with this point. Because of this interconnected global reality, writers are conscious of having an audience beyond their nation, region, and language. So people nowadays are writing in a very different way, knowing that their readership is most likely international compared to many of the earlier authors we read. And that's a really interesting thing. I think it's a hopeful, interesting note to end on for this background and context. All right, let's take a look at our author for this section, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is, one of the most fantastic writers of the 20th century and the best-known novelist of the Latin American boom of the 60s and 70s, where you have these periods, they're often called Renaissance periods, which isn't the best term, but where a certain region or country or culture has kind of a boom where all of a sudden there are a lot of writers writing great works and having both critical and commercial success. And that happened in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, but Marquez is probably the most well-known author from that Latin American boom. And he invented the concept of magic realism. It might be a bit of a stretch to say he invented it. I'm sure other writers were using it around the time, but he did something truly unique in his works that created a mold, basically, for future writers to use, as magical realism is now quite common. He was born in the small town of, let me try to pronounce it, Aracataca, as the first of 12 children, and was raised by his maternal grandparents. It's a big family. Seemed like he had a good relationship with both his grandmother and grandmother on his mother's side, who raised him. They were both very seminal in his influences, and the two things he got from them that you can still see that influence all throughout his work is fantasy, which he got from his grandmother, who would tell him all kinds of fantastical stories, and then an interest in politics, so fantasy and politics, from his grandfather, who had actually fought in one of the many civil wars that took place in Latin America during the 20th century. And I want to talk for just a minute about the fantasy stories his grandma would tell him. So Latin America is a region of the world that had very ancient and old indigenous populations, civilizations that had been around a long time before the Spanish and Portuguese empires conquered the region. We haven't talked a lot about Spanish imperialism because it hadn't really come up yet, but the Spanish Empire was this huge empire that was kind of the world empire just before the British Empire. They kind of shifted hands as the British defeated the Spanish in a few battles in the 17th century, and then Britain became the bigger power. But in those centuries back 17th century back when we were reading Sor Juana's letter, Spain and Portugal was also eminent empire during that time. They really carved up the Latin America region, the South America continent, the way Britain and France and other European countries did Africa. And so these indigenous populations were ravaged, but these indigenous populations had a rich literary history. Now, the stories were mostly oral literature told out loud, and they had many fantastical creatures, kind of mythical, supernatural elements. And so this rich cultural history is a major part of Latin American history, but it's kind of been covered up, if you will, for centuries because of the dismantling and displacement of the local culture as the Spanish and Portuguese Empire took over various Latin American countries. And so writers like Marquez, one of their goals or missions is to reintegrate these wonderful, fantastical folktales, elements of them, into their works. And that's why the magical realism is so much important part of their works. And so the fantasy stories his grandmother would tell him, when she was doing that, she was carrying on the oral tradition, and he was learning about the stories of his people's history, not the colonizers' history. And he wanted to take and integrate those elements into his works in kind of a modern way, kind of bridging the past and the present, to breathe new life into these stories of his people's past, to resurrect them, but doing so in a modern context. Because, as we've said, it's this hybridity in these post-colonial regions. It's not simply going back to the way it was before. So the folktales, elements of them show up, but in a modern way. All right, so that's an important piece of background. Let's look at a little more of Marquez's history here before we dive into the story. So he studied law at the University of Bogota in 1947, and while he was there, he read Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, the Jorge Luis Borges translation, which is just a great. You probably remember Borges from a couple of lectures ago. We could have read Kafka in that unit on modernism, but we have such a short class. Again, if we had 10 weeks or even 8 weeks as opposed to 6 weeks, we definitely would have read Metamorphosis. It's a truly wonderful story, but it's quite long compared to most of the pieces we're reading, so I really had to pick and choose what we would read of the longer texts. But Metamorphosis is about a man who transforms into a grotesque insect-like creature in his family's response to that. And so Kafka filled his story with these kind of stories, with these kind of fantastical or supernatural elements. And even though he was a German writer, when Garcia Marquez read Metamorphosis and saw this kind of supernatural story, but in a very realist setting, and the supernatural elements just being kind of a vehicle to deliver the realist message of the story, he said, shit, this is exactly the way my grandma talked. I love that quote. And so Kafka's Metamorphosis was sort of the inspiration for the magical realism genre that Marquez invented. And we'll look at that genre in more detail on the next slide. But he was so inspired by reading Kafka the next day, the day after he read Kafka's Metamorphosis, because you can read it in a few hours. He wrote his very first short story. It was called The Third Resignation, and was about a man who's dead and buried. He's not buried alive, he's dead, but his body keeps growing after he's dead and buried until it eventually overcomes the ground and comes out of the tombstone. And so, a very magical kind of story. I just love this little story about Garcia Marquez and his inspiration here. I love reading that kind of things about writers. So after this clearly huge watershed moment, he went on to be a very successful writer and did a number of great novels and stories, but his most successful is called 100 Years of Solitude, which he wrote in 1967. It was an instant bestseller and won many prizes that year, and it's now considered a monument of world literature. Another way to teach this class, if we had more time, would be to try to read 7 or 8 novels, over the 10 weeks. And if we did that, this one would have to be among them. We're using more of a survey approach because of the short length of this class rather than an approach like that would look at fewer texts and more depth. But that would definitely be one of them. It's one of the most important texts in the history of world literature. And it's a generational story that tells the story of 3 generations of the family over a period of 100 years. And it's in a fictional mythical town, but one that's very similar to the town Arakataka, where Marquez grew up. And the title is really important. So it's 100 years, so 3 generations of this family of solitude. And so the word solitude is probably the most important word to know when studying Marquez. It's one of the 3 most important themes we'll look at in the story we're studying today. And it is a term he also used in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and it's basically a term he has used to come to represent the suffering of the people in Latin America. So solitude is the word Marquez has chosen to represent the suffering of the people in Latin America. Keep that in mind as we go forward. His later work after this was preoccupied with contemporary events, especially the horrible regimes, the totalitarian dictatorships in Latin America. And his writing was so politically motivated. You'll see kind of like a theme here that we've also seen with Matthews and other writers we've looked at. Salman Rushdie, who we're not studying in this class because he shows up in the British Literature Survey, but there were even rumors of a plot backed by the Colombian government to assassinate him. So we've now had, I think, at least 3 or more writers we've looked at whose writings, were so politically challenging that, challenging to the politics in their own countries, that they risked death to write. I mean, they braved death to write these things. I think that's such an important thing to know. That the ideas in the literature are so important to the writers. They're willing to brave death. And so he sought asylum in Mexico in 1981 and spent the last years of his life living in Mexico City, Europe, and Colombia. It was just a death threat and kind of a rumor. It wasn't a fatwa like was put on Salman Rushdie. So he was actually able to go back to Colombia some and live to a pretty ripe old age, lived to be in his 70s and died in 2014. All right, so before we look at the threads, I want to take a look at magical realism in more detail because it's so crucial. It's such an important aspect of recent literature and so important to Latin American literature, and was essentially, as I said, invented by Garcia Marquez. But he was also inspired by other writers besides Kafka, who inspired the magical realism genre. And so we'll also talk about some other influences in addition to magic realism on this slide. But the majority of the slide is devoted to magic realism. So let's look at that first. So again, he got the idea for it from Kafka, who didn't exactly do magic realism, but did something close enough to it to inspire magic realism. And so what he saw in Kafka was a mobile balance of keep that in mind, mobile balance, it's in motion, of non-realistic events and realistic detail that, when combined with his grandmother's quixotic stories and his grandfather's political concerns, would become the genre of magical realism. So kind of a fluidity or a mobility between non-realistic events and realistic detail. So the tone of the story, the narrator's tone, the way the narrator describes details is very realistic in the realist genre, but then unrealistic things happen, events. So it's not the tone of the story that's fantastical, it's just some of the things that happen within it. And that's a very interesting thing. You'll see it in this story, Death Constant Beyond Love. And you've probably seen it in other stories, but when it shows up, it's quite fascinating because you have this very realist context when all of a sudden something you're not expecting at all happens. And so that's the inspiration. That's where magic realism comes from. But we also need to define magic realism. So I've tried to unpack it for you here and break it down into 3 specific points. The characters in the stories, like all characters, have subjective beliefs and experiences. So in a realist work, depending on how much detail they want to go into, the author wants to go into, these subjective beliefs and experiences might not be as clear as they are in other works. So, someone like Flaubert uses a very free, indirect discourse where he does not tell you the thoughts of his characters, but through their actions, you really come to understand those characters, whereas a realist like Dostoevsky is giving you a lot more, especially with the Underground Man, of what's going on in their heads. But all characters have these subjective beliefs, and whether the Underground Man just tells them to you or we discern them through Felicity's actions, they are there. But characters, as with all human people, their beliefs, their experiences are shaped and formed by some kind of context. So what was the context for the Latin American people of Garcia Marquez's world and stories? Well, their context is the earlier folklore and supernatural beliefs, that oral, long, rich, fantastical oral tradition from which his grandma told him stories. And so when the characters in Marquez's stories have beliefs and experiences, those beliefs and experiences are informed by that folkloric culture. So then what happens? The narrator treats those beliefs and experiences as if they are real. So something from the folklore might really represent well what's going on inside someone's head. And so that thing will then come to life in the text. So in other words, this event, this supernatural event that is all of a sudden thrown into the realist context, it might not be really happening, but it gives us insight to the character's psychology and their cultural history and background that informs their psychology. So the key word there is the narrator treats these beliefs and experiences as if they are real. So the prime example of this is Garcia Marquez's short story, An Old Man with Very Enormous Wings, or Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. I can't remember where the very goes in the title. It's a very short story, much shorter and less complex than the one we're reading here. It's in almost every short story anthology you can find. So I think the editors of this anthology wanted to give us a little bit longer, a little bit more complex story that's not so familiar. You most likely read it in high school or somewhere, but it illustrates this concept so clearly because it's about a couple who are poor And in their backyard, they all of a sudden one day find a man who has an old man with gigantic wings, just like it says. And he's treated as a miracle. And so from people come from near and far to see him, and the couple are able to make money off of this. And they eventually convert their house from this kind of decrepit farm into like this palace. And he's still in their backyard suffering. His wings are broken. He can't fly away. And they're just making money on them. So it's a critique of a selfish, greedy kind of mentality, because the central theme is really hospitality, and they're not showing him hospitality. So you could tell the exact same story without having a man with enormous wings. There's plenty of stories like that. But the man with the wings enables us to see this psychological insight to the two main characters. So with this story, Death Constant Beyond Love, we'll look at something pretty similar to that in a different kind of context. But that's, I think, helpful background. If you've read that story before, you can kind of see where we're going here. So in addition to Faulkner, we're going to talk about Faulkner now. In addition, I got excited because I love Faulkner. In addition to Kafka and the importance of magical realism to understanding Garcia Marquez's texts, William Faulkner was the other huge influence on him. And he really influenced Garcia Marquez with setting. Beyond magical realism, the next most important thing to understanding Marquez's texts are the settings. And he really got his idea for setting from Faulkner. But he got two ideas from Faulkner. One was the subjective experience of the characters through stream of consciousness. So we talked about stream of consciousness with James Joyce and Virginia Woolf a little bit. We haven't really read any stories with it. It was a very important part of the modernist movement that's still around today. And in other works, Garcia Marquez really uses that technique. He doesn't really use it in this story, but the setting is incredibly important in this story, which is the other thing he borrowed from Faulkner. And Faulkner is the best-known author, and my favorite author from the U.S., but best-known author from the southern part of the U.S., and he creates this county with different fictional cities that mirror the real area where he lived in the southern U.S. called Yoknapatawpha County. I think it's a Native American name. But it's an underdeveloped geographical region beset by a long history of conflict, which is also the exact type of area Marquez depicts in Colombia. So you can see the connection there. And like I said, setting is incredibly important to Death Constant Beyond Love. So let's take a look at that story now. Couple of threads I want to point out here so that you have these things in your mind before we look at the language from the story. There's one more like contextual piece that's really important I've included here, which is the Renaissance tradition of love sonnets. And so if you're familiar with this tradition, it's evoked here because we have a story about love, right? It's called Death Constant Beyond Love. And the female beloved character here is named Laura. So that's a direct reference to this tradition. So the tradition was during the Renaissance, first in Italy and then in England, this type of poem that was 14 lines long called a sonnet was invented. Hopefully you're familiar with it from poetry classes, by a man named Petrarch in Italy. He was the first one, and then many people imitated it. For a few hundred years, it was the most popular and common poetic form in Europe. And it's a type of poem where in these 14 lives, the speaker shows devotion to an unattainable beloved. So he loves this woman. He showers praise upon her exterior beauty, but he can never have her. And so that leads to a very psychological trauma, not being able to have her because she's unattainable. And so, like I said, this style, for whatever reason, became incredibly popular. It gets kind of overly dramatic and is very angsty because of the unattainable beloved and the kind of over-the-top, exaggerated psychological trauma of not being able to attain her. So William Shakespeare, who wrote his own sequence of sonnets, made fun of this. In a really great poem, Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, "My lady's eyes are nothing like the sun." Because in Petrarch's very first sonnet, he says his lady's eyes are like the sun. And they often compared, the body parts, like the eyes of women, to different things like the sun or other parts of nature to praise them. And so Shakespeare makes fun of that. It's kind of a ridiculous tradition, but the sonnet is a really interesting form of poetry because it follows a very specific format, and it's still, even though the content is different, the most used poetic form. And so we owe that invention to Petrarch. The way this connects to Death Constant Beyond Love is that he excuse me. I lost my train of thought there for a second. I apologize. The way this connects to Death Constant Beyond Love is that these sonnet writers like Petrarch and Shakespeare would often write a sequence of sonnets, usually over 100 poems, that kind of told a story of the relationship between the speaker and the beloved if you read the collection of sonnets in its entirety. So there was usually one beloved per sonnet sequence, and that beloved would have a name. And Petrarch's beloved was named Laura. And so the repetition of the name of the character, Laura Farina, every time Garcia Marquez says Laura Farina in the story, every time he says her name, he says Laura Farina. He says the whole name each time. So he really wants us to be familiar with her name. And so with the focus on love in the story, and with this being the character's name, we have a very clear allusion to this sonnet style. So now that you're familiar with that, keep it in the back of your mind and try to think about how these elements of it, the devotion to an unattainable beloved, relate to the story we're reading. A couple of other things I want to look at. There's an important set of relationships in this story between things that are opposites. We call these dichotomies or binaries. So past, present, rural, urban, illusion, reality. Again, keep these in the back of your mind. We'll see how these show up in the story. And then there's the three most important themes to the story: solitude, love, and death. So the title is Death Constant Beyond Love, right? We talked earlier about how solitude is the most important word for interpreting Marquez's works because it is the word he used to represent the suffering of people in Latin America. And after 100 Years of Solitude, his next most famous novel is Love in the Time of Cholera, which, like 100 Years of Solitude, is also a wonderful book. You should read both of them before you die. Sometime in your life, read both of those stories. And of course, in the title of this story, we have the word death. But writers, as you know, will use the same kind of themes to engage with similar issues and make similar messages throughout their literary canon. And so these are the three most important words to understanding any of Marquez's works: solitude, love, and death. Which means what we need to do here as we read the story is ask the question, what is the relationship between these three things, solitude, love, and death, and how does that relationship reveal the story's meaning? So that's what we're going to do. We'll look at a few passages that I think are crucial to understanding the story, 3 of them, and then we'll look at all the passages that involve magical realism and finally arrive at our thesis. And so the first 2 passages have to do with setting. And then the third passage is the introduction of Laura's character. And so for this first passage, I actually have the opening paragraph of the story and then a couple sentences from the second paragraph, basically the first number of sentences in the story, because this story is a great opening. I don't know if I've ever read a story that gives you as much information in such a beautiful but kind of fun way in such a short space in just the first few sentences. And it's a rural setting, which is important to keep in mind, and the narrator calls it an illusory setting, which of all of the words we're about to read, I think is probably the most important one, so keep that in mind as we read. Senator Onésimo Sanchez had 6 months and 11 days to go before his death when he found the woman of his life. Is there a better opening sentence than that? He met her in Rosa del Viri, which means rosebush of the viceroy, in a lusory village, which by night was the furtive wharf for smugglers' ships, and on the other hand, in broad daylight, looked like the most useless inlet on the desert, facing a sea that was arid and without direction and so far from everything, no one would have suspected that someone capable of changing the destiny of anyone lived there. Even its name was kind of a joke, because the only rose in that village was being worn by Senator Onésimo Sanchez himself on the same afternoon when he met Laura Farina. It was an unavoidable stop in the electoral campaign he made every 4 years. The carnival wagons had arrived in the morning. Then came the trucks with the rented Indians who were carried into the towns to enlarge the crowds at public ceremonies. So a really powerful passage with a lot packed into it. The genius of this opening paragraph should be obvious, but let's point out a few important things. One is the name of the town, or the village. It's a village. It's important to remember, because the term village, anywhere you go in the world, pretty much means rural, kind of pre-modern. So it's a village. That's important. The rose is important. It's called Rosebush. So the town is named Rose, but it doesn't look like a rose. The only rose in the story is the one the senator is wearing. So the rose is an important symbol. Keep that in mind. And it's not a very kind description of this town, but it's not done in a disdainful way. The narrator does not seem to resent this place. He describes it in about as unappealing way as possible, but it's a very objective narration. This is what we call a realist story, because it sounds like a place no one would want to live, but the narrator himself doesn't sound like he'd have any issue living there. He's presenting it in a very objective way. So it's this very rural setting that I would say, it's 1970 when Marquez wrote this. So modernity is in full force. So it's a rural village that's kind of been left behind by modernity. It hasn't modernized, but the world around it has become modern. So it's not like kind of a primitive place hidden away. It's kind of just there, and it's like old and dusty, basically. That rural connection is important. We look at those set of relationships: past, present, rural, urban, illusion, in reality. So the past and the rural are kind of on the same side of that set of binaries, right? We don't think of rural places being part of the present day, modern world. And the last point two more points I want to make here, and then we'll move on. One is the rented Indians, right? So in a minute, we're going to look at the next important part of the setting, which is that the senator has this like fake town he carries around with him everywhere as part of his campaign. And part of that fake town is the rented Indians. The Indians are important because we talked about the thriving, long-standing indigenous populations of Latin America that were ravaged by the empires of Spain and Portugal. So there are centuries upon centuries, of intermarrying, and usually the people who are descended from the Spanish and Portuguese colonists are higher up and more well-to-do in society than those who are descended from the indigenous inhabitants. And so the Indians here represent the indigenous people. The term means essentially the same thing in Latin America as it does in the U.S. and all throughout the Americas, indigenous. And so you're in this rural village that's representative of the past. The Indians are also representative of the past. And so he has that term rented Indians is so interesting. Like essentially descendants of indigenous people that he's hired to be a part of his dog and pony show here. And so his connection, he has no authentic connection to the rural indigenous past that this village has, but he wants the votes from the voters in the village, right? So he brings rented Indians to the town and puts on this ridiculous carnivalesque show to gain those votes. And so that comes through in that final sentence there. The other point I want to make before we move on is the idea of illusory. This is an illusory village. It's an illusion. Is the village itself even real? I have to ask that question. Or is this all an experience that happens in the senator's mind as he's dealing with his diagnosis of being terminally ill? I don't know. But there's this blurring of illusion and reality that happens in Marquez where there's ambiguity. You don't really know what's real and what's illusion. And that's very intentional on his part, and he's not going to answer the question. It's a realist setting that you have a senator, you have a voter, you have the voter's daughter, and their relationship is the driving force of the story. So it's very much rooted in reality. But he calls it an illusory village, almost like an imagined rural place. But it's not a fantasy either. It's old and dusty. So we have to try to tread and balance that line between illusion and reality, never quite knowing what's real or not when we read Marquez. So one important aspect of the setting is this illusory village where the story takes place. The other part is the town within the village. The senator sets up a fake town inside this illusory village to win votes. I mean, it might seem very real, the story to you when you read it, and then all you have to do is look at the first paragraph to know that it's a fake town inside of an illusory village. Well, let's look at what the senator's fake town is like. The audience turned around. An ocean liner made of painted paper was missing behind the houses, and it was taller than the tallest houses in the artificial city. Only the senator himself noticed that since it had been set up and taken down and carried from one place to another, the superimposed cardboard town had been eaten away by the terrible climate, and that it was almost as poor and dusty as Rosso del Veri, the village they're in. So like it says, he takes this fake town with him to different rural places to, I guess, impress the people there and get votes. It makes him look important, and he uses the fake Indians to try to have some kind of forced artificial connection to the rural past. So these are the two important parts of the setting. Now let's look at the description of Laura. I want to just make a point about her name. We talked about her first name is a reference to the Petrarchan tradition of Renaissance love sonnets. But her last name, Farina, in Spanish means flower. So it's also an allusion to the rustic, rural poor. So you have this like wealthy senator, and you have this rural woman from the rural poor part of the world, meeting each other. And so that's very important. But let's look at the description of her. His daughter came out into the yard when she heard the greeting. She was wearing a cheap, faded Guajiro Indian robe. Her head was decorated with color bows, and her face was painted as protection against the sun. But even in that state of disrepair, it was possible to imagine that there had never been another so beautiful in the world. So a couple of things we have to know. Laura is incredibly beautiful, but she's in this setting that is dusty and old, poor and dusty and old. So it's like, even in that state of disrepair, she's beautiful. So her hyperbolic beauty, the exaggerated state of her beauty, is very much reminiscent of the Renaissance love tradition. The beloveds in those poems, their beauty is always so exaggerated, it's unrealistic. So her beauty is almost unrealistic here. And it's placed in this dusty, old setting. So, make of that what you will. There's also the idea that she's wearing this Guajiro Indian robe. So again, she's connected to the rural past, the past of the indigenous people, which in a modern context is rustic and poor. It's outdated and no longer thriving economically because it's this village it's this rustic, poor village in a modern setting. And so Laura is part of that setting, but she stands out because she's beautiful. All right, so now let's look at the passages with magic realism. So we can kind of look at all these at once, and then on the slide after this, when I get to my thesis statements, I'll break down the significance of each of them, because the magical or fantastical elements are not necessarily real, but are there to reveal the psychological reality of the characters. So from these instances of magic realism, we learn a lot about the senator and Laura. There was a pattern to his circus. As he spoke, his aides threw clusters of paper birds into the air, and the artificial creatures took on life, flew about the platform of planks, and went out to sea. So it's really interesting here, because usually you would have something from one of the folk tales or legends that informs one of the characters who's like a descendant of an indigenous person come to life. But instead you have this senator who's as distant from that rural past as possibly can be, has artificial town with artificial birds, and those birds come to life. So he's not bringing to life the creatures of the folk tales and legends. He's bringing to life the creatures of the senator, who is very distant from that rural past, but it's nonetheless his psychology, right? These are his creations. He's the main character. So Marquez is using the magical realism techniques the same ways he does in his most famous novels, but to represent a different perspective than the one he usually represents. While he was speaking, the senator had torn a sheet off the calendar and fashioned a paper butterfly out of it with his hands. He tossed it with no particular aim into the air currents coming from the fan, and the butterfly flew about the room and then went out through the half-open door. The senator went on speaking with a control aided by the complicity of death. Two important things here. One, again, the same person, the senator, is taking something he's made out of paper that can fly and throwing it, and then it becomes real and flies around. The fan could be carrying it in the room, but then it flies out of the room and outside the building. That's when it becomes magical. And two, after he does this, he goes on speaking with his constituents here, and he speaks aided by the complicity of death. So this is a scene where he's being very real about what he thinks about this town, and he says things about, like, these are poor people, but we're not really going to help them at all, because if we need their vote, and if we help them, it gets better here, then they won't need our vote anymore. And so death is the driving force of most of his actions, as we'll see on the next slide, because he knows he's going to die soon. He's acting in a way he might not otherwise. And in this particular setting, he can speak to these people this way because they're not from the town. He's speaking to people who work for him about the town. And then Laura shows up because she's been sent there by her father. Laura saw the butterfly come out. Only she saw it because the guards in the vestibule had fallen asleep on the steps, hugging their rifles. After a few turns, the large lithographed butterfly unfolded completely, flattened against the wall, and remained stuck there. Laura tried to pull it off. "It won't come off," the guard said sleepily. "It's painted on the wall." So this is a really interesting scene. The butterfly flies out, and then it flies into the wall. And so we have to ask the question, is it the same butterfly? He makes a butterfly out of paper. There's also a butterfly painted on the wall. So it's like two different butterflies. And they both come to life for each character, ideally to represent two different things. But because theoretically, if it were real, it could have been the same butterfly. But this shows that it's not. I think what the fact that it's not the same butterfly shows is that the connection between the two of them is an artificial one. This is not true love. All right, there's one more passage of magic realism here that really reveals the relationship between the senator and Laura. This is when they actually meet. The senator understood. He scrutinized the sleeping guards, then he scrutinized Laura Farina, whose unusual beauty was even more demanding than his pain, and he resolved then that death had made his decision for him. "Come in," he told her. Laura Farina was struck dumb, standing in the doorway to the room. Thousands of banknotes were floating in the air, flapping like the butterfly, but the senator turned off the fan, and the bills were left without air and alighted on the objects in the room. "You see," he said, smiling, "even shit can fly." So a couple of quick things from this. One, these are the things, the banknotes, right, that really represent the senator's empty life, right? He only cares about power and fame. And so they're floating in the air, but as soon as you turn the air off, they fall down. But it's magical realism because the air from the fan is not enough to actually make all of these dollar bills float. And Laura's like awestruck by it. We also have to make a quick note of why she's there, because the only important character in the story we haven't talked about yet is her father. If this were a face-to-face class, I would have put some quotes on the screen in the classroom and asked you, what do you think of the senator? What do you think of Laura? What do you think of her father? Because they're the three main characters. But I would hope your response would be that the father is like the worst character. This is a guy who murders his first wife, doesn't have to serve much time for it, moves to another country, and then basically pimps out his daughter so that he can be allowed to stay in that country and avoid further consequences from killing his first wife. I just have to make note of it because he's not really an important character. That part of the story is really necessary to drive the plot forward. But reading this as a father, I have two young daughters. This is the most unimaginable thing to me that he would send her there and, with the chastity belt, basically like use her, you can sleep with my daughter if you do X, Y, and Z. It's just the most despicable thing. But I think the passage, I would have put it on the screen, but I knew this was going to be a long lecture anyway, and I didn't want to bombard you with too much. That first describes her father is really interesting because it describes his actions, but with a very indifferent tone. The narrator's not, again, that's that realist tone. The narrator's not commenting on them because they're terrible, but it's just stating them in a matter-of-fact way. And I think what that does is shows us how in these Latin American countries where there were terrible totalitarian regimes and dictatorships throughout the latter part of the 20th century, and people, like the people in this village, suffered greatly, that a murderer living there is just kind of like a normal thing, which is tragic in its own ways, but it's an important device Marquez uses through the tone of the narrator to convey something important about Latin America at this time. All right, so what do we learn from all of these things? I'm going to have a slide with some thesis statements that basically show us what the instances of magical realism reveal about the senator and Laura, then one final thesis of what I think the meaning of the whole story is. So I said this already, I'll just kind of repeat it quickly. Garcia Marquez uses magical realism a little differently in this text. The imagined creatures of the senator's beliefs and experiences do come to life, but they are informed by his artificial creations he uses to achieve power and fame rather than the folklore and supernatural beliefs of the local people. So instead of bringing to life things from the oral tradition of the local people, he's bringing to life the things from the senator's circus, fake town he uses on his travels, because the senator, rather than like a person with like the indigenous background, is the main character here. But he still does the same thing. Imagined creatures still come to life. But what does it tell us? It tells us the senator is empty inside. I think that's one of the main points of the story. He has power and fame and wealth because he's a senator, but he's empty inside. There's nothing else to him. He has no real human connection. He doesn't really seem to care about anything. He's willing to sleep with this girl because she's incredibly beautiful, and he's lonely, even though at home he has a wife and 5 children. And it's completely wrong to do that. The senator is really representative of kind of the empty, ineffective governments of these Latin American countries that Marquez is critiquing in a political kind of a text. And the fact that paper airplanes and paper butterflies come to life rather than magical creatures from the country's past shows the emptiness and the ineffectiveness of the government. Lauren, on the other hand, is the other person we're getting psychological insight about through this, reaches for something she can't grab, which supposedly came from the senator, and thereby shows that their connection, like everything else in the story, is artificial, and that she lacks agency, functioning as a means to an end for the 2 male characters whose selfish desires push the events of the narrative forward. So the more I thought about it, the more I was troubled by Laura's character. She is like the Laura of the love sonnets. She has no agency herself. Those love sonnets are not about the beloved. The speaker in those love sonnets only describes the beloved's exterior beauty, never her interior beauty. And it's all about the speaker's psychological state. It's not about the beloved at all. And so the only female character in this text is one who is just fulfills desires for the male characters. Her father can use her as a means to get what he wants, and then the senator can use her as a means to feel a little bit less lonely as he more clearly sees the emptiness of his life as he approaches death. And so I think it's probably a commentary from Marquez on the lack of freedom for women in these places at this time, but it's a very kind of tragic character in the story. Finally, the artificiality of the village, the fake town, and the connection between the senator and Laura all reveal the broken condition of the modern human person. The characters suffer because they are disconnected from a more magical rural past. So again, the town is like a relic of the past, but it's a relic. It no longer has life or vitality because it's failed to modernize, but it's not like one can escape into like an Edenic, primitive, idealized past either. It's kind of caught between the past and the present. And so the magic of the past is not alive for these characters. They're not able to access it. And so I think what Marquez is saying is to have true love, to have true beauty, we have to retain some of the past. We have to retain a connection to these indigenous oral stories and literatures. He's basically using like a story of opposites. There's no character to like here because he's showing us everything we don't want, that we don't want to be. All right, I'm going to look at the very final few sentences of the story to give, my final thesis here of what it's about. Then she laid his head on her shoulder with her eyes fixed on the rose. The senator held her about the waist, sank his face into Wood's animal armpit, and gave in to terror. 6 months and 11 days later, he would die in that same position, debased and repudiated because of the public scandal with Laura Farina and weeping with rage at dying without her. So, and just like at the start of the story, we get a ton of information in just a few sentences. The story is nicely book-ended that way. And so what's important to see from this passage? The rose represents the love and vitality, because those are the things a blooming rose represents, that is missing from the characters' lives and from the rural village that is poor and dusty, because it has not successfully made the transition to modernity, but is ironically called Rose of the Viceroy. So the town is a rose, but it's not in bloom like the rose on his shirt that she's looking at. And Laura is someone who's kind of caught, the city that's caught between, this village that's caught between the past and the present, and lacks the vitality of the past, that hasn't fully modernized. Laura is someone who has no options there, who's willing to sleep with this guy who doesn't really care about her, that she doesn't even know because her father needs her to. She's looking for something with the butterfly, looking for something with the rose that she can't quite access. And finally, here's the thesis. Solitude is worse than death. Love can overcome it, but the characters in the story do not actually know love. So it's called Death Constant Beyond Love. The background and context, and the Norton talks about how that's the reversal of a title of a sonnet from the Renaissance period called Love Constant Beyond Death. Those Renaissance sonnet writers I've been talking about also used as a prominent theme that the love in their poetry would make them immortal. That's not what happens here. It's the reverse of it. But I would argue it's because this is not true love. This is not real love. This is not what Marquez would call love. If you want to read his novels, 100 Years of Solitude, and moreover, Love in the Time of Cholera, you will see that he does have beautiful love stories in his canon. This is not one of them. Laura and the senator are missing the type of love that would endure beyond death. But here, death is constant beyond love rather than love constant beyond death, because love here is artificial. It's illusory. It's not real. I think Marquez would argue you can have that love, but not in this setting or this context. Again, it's a kind of, everything here is the opposite of what he believes you would want or what is ideal. And so the senator dies alone. He loses everything because of Laura. Laura gives him momentary happiness, but not long-lasting happiness. And so he dies alone, which is the worst possible thing, right? But again, if solitude represents the plight of the Latin American people, I think what Marquez is saying in the last sentence of the story is that the worst thing for the senator is not that he died, but that he was alone. He was in solitude.